Namatai, I would like to invite you to go first in terms of unpacking the topic of Zimbabwean crisis, women as solution holders, what needs to be done. Namatai, can you hear me?
Hello, now I can hear you.
Okay.
Hello.
I was saying I'd like you to go first in terms of unpacking the topic, the Zimbabwean crisis, women as solution holders, what needs to be done. Would you like to take your 5 minutes now?
Absolutely great. All right, so I think maybe I'll just start by saying that we need to be cognizant of the fact that whatever solutions are going to be brought in this country with regards to the Zimbabwean crisis, women, and in particular young women, are going to have to be central. And we say this in the context that women constitute the majority of the population, and particularly young women. So I think that maybe the first thing that needs to be stated and that needs to be clearly articulated is the crisis itself. What are we taming, the Zimbabwean crisis? What's the Zimbabwean crisis? And in this context, we appreciate that it's an amalgamation of different facets, from the economic, the social, the political. All of these things are interacting in such a way that they're going to affect men and women differently. They're going to affect older women and younger women differently. And that's in the context of the crisis. So maybe we start off with the political crisis. In the context that human rights violations are something that are very imminent, in the context that there is no freedom of speech, in the context that we're seeing young women, human rights defenders, young political activists who are women, being brutalized, sometimes even sexually. So we experience a certain kind of violence that is unique and specific to us because we are women. Then we look at it from the perspective of the social aspect, we look at it from the perspective of the economic aspect. The lockdown, the COVID-19 lockdown, has intensified a crisis that had already been there. And we'll see that the number of, the number of abuses, domestic violence, and things like that has actually escalated. So we think about this from the context that how is it affecting women? We appreciate that men and women are different, and we appreciate that women will uniquely experience, this crisis differently from whatever part it's coming from. So it's quite instrumental for us to then say women have to be central when it comes to resolving this crisis and solving this crisis. Because when you look at it from the perspective that young women, first of all, like I say, they constitute the majority. Then second of all, we are not in a position where we are going to have solutions that are going to be inclusive for everyone, solutions that are going to, in all of these issues, also be cognizant and sensitive to women and their specific needs. If we are not being represented by women in decision-making and in positions of influence. So I actually say that the crisis that we experience in our country is because we have a patriarchal regime, we have a patriarchal government, and this patriarchy escalates itself to business, it escalates itself to economics, it escalates itself to all other facets of life. And one of the key things that we must work on for us to be in a position where we, assist women, or maybe assist is not the appropriate word, but where we create opportunity for women to actually be in a position where they are strategically positioned to, solve the crisis that exists, is to feminize our system, to feminize our government, feminize our political parties, feminize our businesses, so that we ensure that women are represented. And one of the key things that is essential in making sure that that happens is being able to implement the Constitution, which clearly stipulates aspects to do gender parity. So I think for now, I'll settle at that.
Thank you so much, Namatai. And I really like what you said in terms of the feminization of the Zimbabwean crisis, because it brings about the different narratives that both men and everyone, men and women are facing, but especially young women. So thank you for that. Mantate, would you like to go for your 5 minutes now and unpack the topic, the Zimbabwean crisis, women as solution holders, what needs to be done?
Thank you so much, Grace. Thank you, Namatai, as well, for just opening for us. I wanted to just focus on 3 key areas that I feel are of concern to me, especially as a young woman. Because I feel like sometimes when you talk about the crisis having affecting women, we tend to forget that there's that demographic of young women that really needs to be discussed. So the first thing that I wanted to have a conversation about is the issue of the lockdown itself, the fact that a lot of young women were forced to stay at home, some of them staying at home with people that have been for a long time perpetrators of abuse. So you discover that a lot of them were not safe at home. And just recently, I think 3 days back, we had a headline in one of our newspapers that was the way it was written, it was something like shock as 4 grade 7 schoolgirls fall pregnant during lockdown. And the conversation that has been there on Twitter and other social media platforms has been a question of when did we shift from calling it rape to a situation where we just assume or state something that talks of us being shocked that girls were pregnant, but we move away from the idea that this is actually reflective of abuse and sexual violation, because these are grade 7 kids, these are underage kids, so they did not consent to this. So I think that's the biggest problem I've had as well, issues of safety for our girls, but also within that framework of staying at home as well. If you're looking at some of those cases of abuse, you discover that if a child is abused by a father or a brother, because now they're spending more time with the family would rather protect they call it the dignity of the father, but I don't understand why we speak of the dignity of a man when he's abused and indignified a woman. So that's one of the problems that I feel we really have as a crisis in the country. But also I'm looking at a situation where if you look at places like Bulawayo, where there's a huge water crisis, and I've been seeing a lot of tweets and videos around the fact that people are going as early as 4 a.m. or even earlier just to hold queues so that they get water in boreholes, or at least prepare for when the council water comes for delivery and stuff like that. So you discover that it becomes very unsafe for young women, because if I'm gonna wake up at 4 a.m. and have to queue for water, it means that at the level of security, I am not safe as a young woman. So there's a higher risk of sexual abuse of young women due to this water crisis. But also looking at this water crisis, the other thing that we have as a challenge in Zim is the issue of access to sanitary ware for girls. I think this has been really accelerated around this COVID-19 period, because I remember when the national budget was approved, we were told that there was a budget allocation for young girls in schools to actually get sanitary ware. But because schools have been closed and no one has been holding the government accountable to say who actually got the sanitary pads, because the kids are they're actually at home and not at school. So that's another question that needs to be answered. But beyond that as well, there is the issue of the transport crisis in Zimbabwe right now, where you're realizing that a lot of the people are having to queue for Zuko buses, and you discover that some of those queues actually stretch to the evening, and you find that some of those girls have to take even longer to get home. And it comes back to the issue of the security after dark, because I think we've seen reports of how crime has generally increased, there's more robberies around this time, so you discover that our girls are not safe. But more than just the problems that we're looking at, I think the question that we're really trying to answer today is what must be done. And my first point of call really is with the law enforcement itself, because if you look at the crisis I mentioned earlier about grade 7 girls that have fallen pregnant, one of the things that was noted is that the police is not actually, they don't seem proactive around the issue. And when you discover, the report is talking about a conversation with the district education officer, one of the things it mentions is that we will wait for schools to open and then we'll see who is absent and then take up the issue. And that worries me a lot, because while you're waiting for schools to open, and you can look at the number of girls that are not showing up at school, so that you can determine or decide that, okay, these are potentially the girls that have been abused or the girls that have fallen pregnant. I think during that time while you're waiting, there's a girl that needs support, there's a girl that needs to report this, because as I said earlier, it's sexual abuse. So we really need the law itself and the Ministry of Education to be more active. But also beyond that, there's the issue of reporting in Zimbabwe, where a lot of our girls are struggling to report abuse because the police doesn't take them seriously, or in some instances you find that someone goes to the police to report abuse, and these police officers will actually ask these kids or these young girls to sleep with them in order to accelerate these cases. So that's another big problem. And also coming back to the media as well, to say the way that we report issues, especially issues of abuse of young women, also has a lot with the way that people receive it. Because if you look at a situation where someone reports shock as 4 grade 7 girls fall pregnant during lockdown, instead of actually saying rape of young girls or primary school girls, you discover that focus moves away from perpetrators of sexual abuse into actually blaming the victims for apparently falling pregnant. And there's that issue as well for civil society and everyone else to actually hold government accountable. For instance, in issues of access to sanitary, where I mentioned that there was a budget allocation for sanitary pads, but to this day, we're not told who actually got this, because the promise had been that it's going to schoolgirls, but no one has been at school since March. So the question really is, where did this money go? And then also the last thing that I think must be done is the increase in the number of safe houses. I mentioned earlier that some of these girls are forced to stay at home with perpetrators of violence or sexual abuse. So discover that there is no place for them to run to. Civil society organization can be overwhelmed as well. So there is need for the state to make provision for the safe houses where young girls can actually go there if they're abused. So I think that's basically my state of the nation right now and some of the ideas for how we can play around addressing these issues.
Thank you, Mantante. That was a very profound unpacking of the topic today. And let me just give Ngamso an opportunity to unpack the topic for us before I'll come back to the panelists. Ngamso, please.
I definitely support Namatai and Mantate's call for women, and particularly young women, to come to the front and to be able to not only brainstorm and give an account of what the issues are, but to also be included in how do we formulate and how do we design the necessary solutions for all of us to be able to live in a safe environment. And that is a safe environment even during the lockdown. I do also express concern that I have heard that there has been a challenge when it comes to access to water and basic human primary services in Zimbabwe. So that is something that definitely would call upon a united force to come up with ideas and to brainstorm solutions as to how do we hold those that are accountable for delivering those primary basic human services, and how do we ensure that the institutions that are responsible for those services to be delivered are actually actioning out their mandate. One of the things that I would like to express interest in also looking at how we can work together to achieve is the inclusion and the support of women who wish to add value to not only legislation, but also developmental theories of change that are necessary in Zimbabwe's case. Also, I would extend that further to say, perhaps touching on including women and supporting women with the appetite to lead efficiently and effectively, most particularly in the legislation environment. And lastly, I would like to also contribute towards ideas of how do we coordinate and network not only women, but all stakeholders who are advocates for human rights, justice, and freedom.
Thank you so much, Ngamso, for that unpacking. Rumbidzai, would you like to take your 5 minutes and unpack the topic, the Zimbabwean crisis, women as solution holders, what needs to be done? Rumbidzai, can you hear me? Rumbi, you're up next, if you can hear me. Okay. Priscilla, would you like to go next? It looks like Rumbidzai's mic is unmuted, but I cannot hear her. Priscilla, would you like to go next?
Yes.
Unpacking the topic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think I would like to start by just congratulating WOW for putting this together. For some of us who have been on this road before, it is a welcome change to what has been going on in Zimbabwe. And you probably know that some of us have refused to comment on anything that is happening in Zimbabwe precisely because we felt that the narrative was very male. And I'm quite excited that we are beginning to talk about how we bring in a feminist narrative to what is going on. So as I speak to the unpacking, I think language is important. I'm not sure that the language that we have taken on in even beginning to talk about this process is a female language. And I'll justify it. Females never really talk around crisis, because if we spoke about crisis, nothing would ever happen. I mean, there's always some problem from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed. That's your women's life. And I think the way we have dealt with it is because we have understood problems as challenges. Because the moment you look at a crisis, it disempowers you. The moment you define something as a crisis, it disempowers you. You start at a level in which this is so big, it can't be dealt with. So I would say, as I unpack what is happening in Zimbabwe, I would say perhaps the lingo has to change. So for Zimbabwe, we are looking at what are the challenges from a feminist perspective. We've been there before. And when I say we've been there before, if you look at the role of women during the challenges, the post-colonial challenges, the role of women as we crafted the constitution, which we are very proud of, was on the basis of what are the challenges and how do we ensure that we deal with those challenges from both an institutional point of view and from a legislative point of view. And there were structures that women built to be able to come to the point where we agreed on what the challenge was. So as we have this